On a moonless night, 3 young urbex explorers decide to venture into the old San Sebastian Sanatorium, abandoned decades ago after a series of mysterious deaths. Armed only with cameras and flashlights, they have no idea of the horrors awaiting them in the depths of that cursed place. What begins as a search for excitement soon turns into a desperate fight for survival as the dark secrets of the sanatorium are revealed one by one. The new moon hid behind heavy clouds, denying even the faintest light to the decaying facade of San Sebastian Sanatorium. The building, an architectural monstrosity of 3 floors, stood like an evil shadow against the night sky. Its broken windows seemed like empty eyes, watching with an insatiable hunger the 3 young people approaching stealthily. Mike, the self-proclaimed leader of the group, checked his backpack one more time. Camera, extra flashlights, water. His girlfriend Jane trembled slightly beside him, but not from the cold. The third member of the group, Jake, filmed everything with his cell phone, narrating in excited whispers for his urban exploration channel. "This is it, guys," Mike murmured, his voice betraying a mix of excitement and apprehension. The infamous San Sebastian Sanatorium, closed in 1987 after a series of unexplained deaths. Jane swallowed hard. "Are you sure this is a good idea? This place has a heavy energy." Jake chuckled softly, but his laughter sounded forced. "Relax, Jane. It's just an old building. What could go wrong?" Oh, if they only knew. If they could hear the whispers already echoing through the abandoned corridors, eager for their arrival. If they could see the shadows moving in the upper windows, watching, waiting. With a foreboding creak, the main door yielded to Mike's touch. The smell of mold and decay hit them like a punch, mixed with something else, something metallic and sickly. "Welcome," Mike joked, trying to ease the tension, "to our home for the next few hours." They entered the lobby, their flashlights creating islands of light in the oppressive darkness. They had no idea that each step took them deeper into a nightmare from which few had escaped. San Sebastian Sanatorium had waited patiently for decades. Tonight it would finally have new guests, and so, with racing hearts and senses on high alert, the 3 young explorers began the journey that would change their lives forever, if they survived to tell the tale. The beams from their flashlights danced over the peeling walls of the lobby, revealing fragments of a dark past. Yellowed papers covered the floor like dead autumn leaves, crunching under their cautious steps. "Look at this," Jane whispered, her voice trembling slightly as she pointed to a rusted sign. "Psychiatric wing." She read aloud, a shiver running down her spine. Mike approached a dust-covered counter. His fingers brushed over a pile of documents, raising a cloud that danced in the air like specters. "Hey, I found something," he murmured, pulling out a file. While Mike flipped through the file, Jake kept filming, his camera capturing the morbid details of the environment. "Man, this is gold for the channel," he commented, focusing on an abandoned wheelchair in the corner. Suddenly, a noise echoed down the right corridor, a sound somewhere between a moan and a whisper. The 3 froze, glancing at each other in the dim light. "Did you hear that?" Jane asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mike nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the dark corridor. "It must be the wind," he said, but even he didn't seem convinced. Jake pointed his camera down the corridor. "Let's check it out," he suggested, the excitement in his voice barely disguising his growing fear. Reluctantly, they moved down the corridor. The smell of mold intensified, now mixed with something else, something that smelled like rotting flesh and chemicals. As they delved deeper into the ground floor of the sanatorium, the noises became more frequent. Creaks, shuffling footsteps, unintelligible whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Mike abruptly stopped, his flashlight illuminating a slightly ajar door. "Records room," he read quietly. With a chilling creak, the door opened fully. What they saw inside made their hearts freeze. Scattered files, yes, but also scratch marks on the walls, dark stains on the floor that looked terribly like dried blood. And there, in the center of the room, a single open file on a dusty table. The title of the document was visible even from a distance: Unauthorized Experiments, Strictly Confidential. At that moment, as if provoked by their discovery, a distant, agonizing scream echoed through the sanatorium's corridors. The terror they had kept at bay until then finally engulfed them completely. They had found much more than they had bargained for, and the sanatorium seemed to have found its next victims. The scream echoed through the corridors, slowly dying away as if swallowed by the very walls of the sanatorium. The three explorers looked at each other, fear palpable between them. "We should leave," Jane whispered, her voice trembling. Mike, however, had his eyes fixed on a door at the end of the corridor. "Wait," he murmured. "Look at that." A rusty metal staircase descended into darkness. A faded sign above read "Restricted Area, Authorized Personnel Only." Jake swallowed hard, but pointed the camera at the stairs. "We can't miss this," he said, trying to sound brave. They descended slowly, each step creaking under their feet. The air grew denser, laden with a pungent smell of chemicals, and something else, something organic and putrid. At the bottom of the stairs, a long corridor stretched out. Metal doors lined both sides, each with a small barred window. "They look like cells," Jane murmured, her voice barely audible. Mike tested one of the doors. To his surprise, it opened with a foreboding creak. The beam of his flashlight revealed a room that made their stomachs churn. Rusty medical equipment occupied the center. A gurney with worn leather straps, a machine covered with buttons and dials. On the walls, metal hooks held chains. "Oh my God," Jake whispered, his camera trembling. What did they do here? A sudden noise made them turn. In the darkest corner of the room, something moved. The flashlight beam caught for an instant the gleam of inhuman eyes before the shadow disappeared through a crack in the wall. "Did you see that?" Mike shouted, stepping back. Before anyone could respond, a cold wind blew through the corridor, carrying whispers in an incomprehensible language. The cell doors began to slam shut one by one, as if invisible hands were testing them. Jane screamed, grabbing Mike's arm. "We have to get out of here, now!" But as they turned towards the stairs, they saw with horror that they were no longer alone. A pale, emaciated figure blocked the way, its tattered clothing resembling a medical gown. Its face was a mask of scars, empty eyes fixed on them. The creature opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp teeth, and let out a scream, identical to the one they had heard before. It was a sound full of pain, anger, and insatiable hunger. Trapped between the horror blocking their escape and the dark mystery surrounding them, the three explorers realized their search for excitement had turned into a very real nightmare, and the night they feared was far from over. The creature's scream echoed down the corridor, paralyzing the three explorers for a crucial moment. It was Mike who reacted first. "Run!" he yelled, pulling Jane by the arm. They darted to the opposite end of the corridor, passing the creature that seemed momentarily confused by their sudden movement. Jake, still filming frantically, was the last to move. "Jake, come on!" Jane shouted over her shoulder. But it was too late. The creature, with inhuman speed, grabbed Jake by the ankle. He fell, his camera sliding across the concrete floor. "Help me!" Jake screamed desperately, his nails scratching the floor as he was dragged into the darkness. Mike hesitated, torn between the instinct to survive and the desire to help his friend. Jane pulled his arm forcefully. "We can't go back," she sobbed. "Let's go." With a heavy heart and Jake's screams echoing in their ears, Mike followed Jane. They ran blindly through the labyrinthine corridors of the basement, turning corners randomly, their flashlights casting distorted shadows on the walls. Finally, exhausted and disoriented, they stopped to catch their breath. The silence was oppressive, broken only by their ragged breathing. Jake, Jane sobbed, leaning against the wall. We left him. Mike ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of guilt. We had no choice, he murmured, but the words sounded hollow, even to him. Suddenly, a metallic noise echoed in the distance. They looked at each other, renewed fear in their eyes. This way, Mike whispered, pointing to a slightly ajar door. They slipped into what seemed to be an old records room. Dusty shelves stretched to the ceiling, filled with folders and boxes. "What are we going to do?" Jane asked, her voice trembling. Mike looked around, desperate for an idea. His gaze fell on a ventilation grate in the corner of the room. "There," he pointed. "We can use the ducts to try to find a way out." As they worked to remove the grate, a dark thought tormented them. What if Jake was still alive somewhere, in that labyrinth of horror? With difficulty they squeezed into the dusty duct. The cold metal against their skin was a constant reminder of the danger surrounding them. As they slowly crawled through the narrow ducts, the sounds of the sanatorium seemed amplified. Creaks, moans, and most disturbingly, what sounded like the distant echo of Jake's screams. "Mike," Jane whispered, her voice breaking. "I think I heard something behind us." Before Mike could respond, the metal beneath them gave way with a deafening crack. For a terrible moment, they were suspended in the air. Then gravity pulled them mercilessly down, separating them in the fall. Jane's scream was the last thing Mike heard before his head hit something hard and darkness swallowed him. Alone and unconscious, Mike was now at the mercy of the horrors lurking in the shadows of San Sebastian Sanatorium, and somewhere in the depths of that hell, Jane faced her own nightmares, separated and terrified. Consciousness returned to Mike like a cold wave. He opened his eyes, blinking in the dim light. Pain throbbed in his head, and the metallic taste of blood filled his mouth. Slowly he got up, his eyes adjusting to the oppressive darkness. "Jane," he called out softly, fear choking his voice. No response. Feeling around, Mike found his flashlight, miraculously intact. The beam of light revealed a scene that made his stomach churn. He was in some kind of laboratory, but unlike any he had ever seen. Metal tables stained with dark red lined the walls. Rusty surgical instruments were scattered around, some still embedded in dried pieces of what looked like human flesh. Glass jars contained deformed specimens floating in murky liquids. "Oh my God," Mike murmured, horror growing in his chest. In a corner, a metal shelf caught his attention. Approaching cautiously, he saw a series of leather-bound notebooks. With trembling hands, he picked one up. "Experiment 37, he read aloud. "Fusion of human consciousness with extra-dimensional entities." The pages were filled with grotesque diagrams and frantic notes, descriptions of procedures that defied sanity, of screams lasting days, of bodies contorting into impossible shapes. Mike dropped the notebook, his world spinning. San Sebastian Sanatorium was not just a hospital. It was the site of experiments that transcended the limits of science and morality. A sudden sound made him turn. In the laboratory door, a figure materialized. For a hopeful moment, Mike thought it was Jane. But the creature that entered was anything but human. Its form constantly shifted, as if unable to decide between being man or beast. Glowing eyes focused on Mike, a mouth full of sharp teeth, opening in a grotesque smile. "Welcome," the creature spoke, its voice a cacophony of whispers. "We have been waiting for new Volunteers. Mike backed away, his body trembling uncontrollably. What are you? The creature laughed, a sound that seemed to come from multiple throats. We are the future, the evolution, the result of decades of experiments to transcend the limits of reality. With growing horror, Mike realized the truth. The patients, the doctors, they had all merged with something beyond human comprehension. And now he and his friends were the next test subjects. "Where are my friends?" he demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. "Oh, they are joining us as we speak," the creature responded, advancing slowly. "Just like you." Mike frantically looked around for an escape, but the only door was blocked by the monstrosity before him. The sound of footsteps and whispers grew louder in the corridors, indicating more creatures were approaching. Cornered and terrified, Mike realized his search for excitement had turned into a very real nightmare. And the true horror was just beginning. Mike's heart pounded frantically against his chest as he faced the grotesque creature before him. In an act of desperation, he grabbed one of the glass jars from the shelf and hurled it at the abomination. The glass shattered, releasing a viscous liquid and a nauseating smell. The creature howled, a mix of pain and fury reverberating through the laboratory walls. Mike took advantage of the momentary distraction and darted towards the door, slipping through the small space between the creature and the wall. "Catch him!" the distorted voice echoed behind him. "Don't let the specimen escape." Mike ran blindly through the dark corridors, his chest burning and his lungs begging for air. The sounds of pursuit grew behind him, shuffling steps, inhuman growls, and the occasional high-pitched scream he prayed wasn't from Jane or Jake. Turning a corner, he found himself in a long, narrow corridor. Doors lined both sides, all closed except one. Without thinking twice, Mike threw himself into the room, closing the door silently behind him. Panting, he pressed his ear against the rotting wood, listening to the sounds of his pursuers passing down the corridor. When silence finally returned, he allowed himself to relax a bit, turning to examine his hiding place. The room was small, probably an old patient room. A rusty bed occupied one corner, and a dust-covered desk was pushed against the opposite wall. But what caught Mike's attention was the broken mirror hanging above the desk. Approaching cautiously, he looked at his fragmented reflection. What he saw made him recoil in shock. His face was pale and covered in sweat, but that wasn't what frightened him. It was his eyes. The irises, once brown, now pulsed with an unnatural glow, changing color like the creatures pursuing him. "No," he murmured, touching his face with trembling fingers. "It can't be." A movement in the corner of the mirror caught his attention. Mike turned sharply, his breath catching in his throat. There, emerging from the shadows like a nightmare-given form, was Jane, or something that had once been Jane. Her body was contorted, limbs elongated at impossible angles. Her skin had a translucent quality, dark veins visibly pulsing beneath the surface. But it was her eyes that paralyzed him, completely black, except for small pinpoints of light dancing like distant stars. "Mike," she gurgled, her voice a grotesque mix of plea and threat. "Join us." Terror froze Mike in place, unable to move as the thing that had been his girlfriend advanced slowly toward him, arms extended in a morbid embrace. At that moment, the reality of the situation hit him with full force. He wasn't just fighting to escape the sanatorium. He was fighting to keep his own humanity, not to become one of the abominations now hunting him. With a strangled scream, Mike launched himself at the door, ripping it open and plunging back into the dark corridors. The hunt resumed, more frantic and desperate than before. Behind him, the chorus of distorted voices grew, calling his name, promising unity, transcendence, and horrors beyond imagination. Mike ran, knowing that every step could be his last before the darkness of San Sebastian Sanatorium consumed him completely. Mike ran through the labyrinthine corridors of the sanatorium, his ragged breath echoing off the damp walls. The sound of his pursuers grew louder with each moment, a cacophony of moans, scratches, and shuffling steps that seemed to come from all directions. Turning a corner, he found himself facing a massive, double metal door. With no other option, he pushed it open with all his strength, entering what seemed to be a vast circular amphitheatre. Moonlight penetrated through a broken skylight in the ceiling, illuminating the grotesque scene before him. In the center of the amphitheatre stood a monstrous machine, a mix of ancient technology and something alien. Pulsating tubes extended from it like tentacles, connecting to glass capsules arranged in a circle. With horror, Mike recognized figures inside the capsules. Patients, doctors, nurses, all in different stages of a horrifying transformation. And there, in one of the closest capsules, was Jake. "Jake!" Mike shouted, running towards his friend. Jake's eyes slowly opened. They were completely white, with no irises or pupils. "Mike," he murmured, his voice distorted by the tubes connected to his mouth. They're transforming us, merging us with something beyond." Before Mike could respond, the amphitheatre doors burst open violently. The horde of creatures that had been chasing him flooded the room, led by the thing that had once been Jane. "There is nowhere to run." Her voice was a chorus of whispers. "Join us, Mike. Transcend the limits of reality." Mike backed away, his eyes darting between the creatures, the machine, and his trapped friend. Then he noticed a control panel near the base of the machine. A desperate idea began to form in his mind. I surrender," he said, raising his hands. "You're right. I want to join you." The creatures hesitated, clearly surprised. Mike took advantage of the moment of confusion to run towards the control panel. "No!" screamed the creature Jane, realizing his intentions too late. Mike reached the panel and, without thinking twice, began pressing every button and pulling every lever he could. The machine roared to life, trembling violently. Lights flickered, and the tubes began pulsing erratically. "What have you done?" screamed one of the creatures, its voice a mix of fury and fear. "Ended this," Mike replied, his voice firm despite the terror he felt. The machine began to collapse. Sparks flew from the connections, and the tubes ruptured one by one. The creatures screamed, their bodies writhing in agony as their transformations reversed chaotically. Mike ran to Jake's capsule, breaking the glass with a piece of metal. He dragged his friend out, ignoring the shards cutting into his skin. "We have to get out of here," he shouted over the deafening noise of the collapsing machine. Supporting Jake, Mike staggered towards the exit. Behind them, chaos reigned. Creatures dissolved into pools of amorphous matter. Others pleaded for help with voices gradually returning to normal. When they reached the door, Mike looked back one last time. His eyes met those of Jane, who had almost completely reverted to her human form. For a moment, he saw recognition and gratitude in her eyes before the ceiling began to collapse. Mike and Jake managed to escape the building seconds before it imploded, taking the horrors of San Sebastian Sanatorium with it, falling onto the damp grass, watching the dust settle over the ruins. Mike finally allowed the tears to come. They had survived, but at a terrible cost. The nightmare was over, but their memories would haunt them forever. As the first light of dawn touched the horizon, Mike knew that nothing in their lives would ever be the same again. The darkness they had faced had left indelible marks on their souls, a constant reminder of the horrors lurking in the shadows of reality. The silence was deafening. Only the distant crackling of flames, still consuming the remnants of San Sebastian Sanatorium, dared to break the eerie morning quiet. Mike was the first to move, his muscles protesting every inch. He turned to Jake, whose eyes, now back to normal, stared blankly at the sky. "Jake," Mike called, his voice hoarse. "Are you... you?" Jake blinked slowly, as if waking from a deep dream. I think so," he murmured. "But I don't feel the same." Mike nodded, understanding perfectly. He also felt changed, as if something fundamental in his being had been irrevocably altered. Slowly they sat up, watching the smouldering ruins of what had once been the sanatorium. The structure had collapsed in on itself, burying the secrets and horrors it contained. "Jane," Jake began, but his voice failed him. Mike closed his eyes, the image of Jane's last look etched into his memory. "She's gone," he said simply, the words laden with pain. The distant sound of sirens began to grow. Someone must have seen the smoke or heard the explosion. "What are we going to tell them?" Jake asked, panic rising in his voice. Mike looked at his hands, noticing with horror that his veins still pulsed with a supernatural glow. "The truth," he responded, "or at least part of it." As the sirens approached, Mike and Jake stood unsteady. The sun was now fully above the horizon, bathing the scene in a golden light that seemed to mock the darkness they had faced. "They'll never believe us," Jake murmured. "They don't need to believe," Mike responded, his voice gaining a firmness that surprised even him. "But we need to tell. For Jane, for everyone we lost in there." The first police cars appeared on the road, followed closely by ambulances. Mike and Jake remained where they were, their shadows stretching long in the morning light. As paramedics rushed towards them and police began to secure the area, Mike felt something change inside him. The terror of the night had left scars, yes, but also a fierce determination. "This isn't over," he said to Jake, low enough that only his friend could hear. Jake looked at him, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You think there are other places like this?" Mike nodded gravely. "And we're going to find them. We're going to expose them, so no one else has to go through what we did." As they were wrapped in blankets and bombarded with questions, Mike and Jake exchanged a look of mutual understanding. The night of terror was over, but their journey was just beginning. The sun continued to rise, relentless over the scene of destruction, and with it was born a new mission, forged in the fire of horror and sealed with the blood of the innocent, lost in San Sebastian Sanatorium. The nightmare had ended. The crusade was about to begin. 6 months after the events at San Sebastian Sanatorium, Dr. Morgan's office was a study in neutral tones, designed to soothe, but for Mike, sitting rigidly in the leather chair, the environment was anything but calming. "How are the nightmares, Mike?" Dr. Morgan's voice was soft, professional. Mike took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on his own hands. The veins still occasionally pulsed with a supernatural glow, a constant reminder of that fateful night. "They've changed," Mike responded after a moment. "They're no longer about running or hiding. Now I'm searching for something, or someone." The psychiatrist nodded, making a note. "And Jake, are you still in contact?" A bitter smile touched Mike's lips. "Yes. In fact, we talk every day. He understands. No one else can." What Mike didn't tell Dr. Morgan was about the long nights he and Jake spent researching, scouring the internet for rumors of other places like San Sebastian Sanatorium, about the files they had created, detailing every lead, every whisper of forbidden experiments and alternate realities. "You mentioned in our last session that you were considering returning to college," Dr. Morgan continued. "Any decision on that?" Mike nodded slowly. "Yes, I'm transferring to theoretical physics, with an emphasis on quantum mechanics." What he didn't mention was the reason. His growing obsession with understanding the science behind what he had witnessed in the sanatorium. The equations he had glimpsed in the mad doctor's notebooks now populated his dreams, mixing with images of Jane and the creatures they had become. "That's an interesting change," Dr. Morgan commented, clearly surprised. "May I ask what motivated that decision?" Mike finally looked into the psychiatrist's eyes. For a moment he considered telling everything. About the creatures, about the machine, about how he and Jake now dedicated every free moment to unraveling the mysteries they had faced. But he knew he couldn't, not yet. "I just feel like I need to understand the world around me better," Mike responded, vaguely. The session ended shortly after, with Dr. Morgan expressing cautious optimism about Mike's progress. As he walked out of the office, Mike checked his phone. A message from Jake flashed on the screen. "I found something. An abandoned asylum in the countryside. Reports of strange lights and missing people. We need to check it out." Mike felt his heart race, a mix of fear and anticipation running through his veins. He replied quickly, "I'm in. When do we leave?" As he waited for the elevator, Mike looked at his reflection in the metal door. His eyes, once an ordinary brown, now had a peculiar, almost iridescent glow in certain lights. A constant reminder of the price they had paid, the elevator arrived with a soft ding. Before stepping in, Mike cast one last look down the empty hallway. For a moment he could almost hear the distant echoes of the screams from San Sebastian Sanatorium. Shaking his head to dispel the memories, he stepped into the elevator. The door closed silently behind him, taking him away from the normal world and towards an uncertain future filled with shadows and secrets waiting to be unraveled. The whispers of the sanatorium had been silenced, but their echoes would continue to reverberate, guiding Mike and Jake on a dark journey through the most obscure corners of reality. And somewhere in the depths of nightmares yet to be dreamed, something awaited them. The terrifying night at San Sebastian Sanatorium is just a glimpse of the horrors hiding in the shadows of our reality. In every abandoned town, in every forgotten building, there are dark secrets waiting to be uncovered. Mike and Jake survived, but at what cost? And how many other places like the sanatorium exist, conducting experiments that defy the laws of nature and sanity? Stay tuned for the next story by Draven Nocturnus, where new shocking revelations and unimaginable terrors await those brave or foolish enough to investigate the darkest corners of our world. Perhaps somewhere in the depths of the night, you will hear the whispers of the sanatorium calling. Sleep well if you can, until the next night of indescribable nightmares.